You are listening to the Mother of All Talk Shows podcast with George Galloway.
This is London, but broadcasting to you, of course, all over the world. Thanks to the wonders of the internet. This is a truly global show. But we're going to concentrate this evening on three places. The first, of course, is Britain, where the general election just passed and delivered a result that you could have known if you'd listened to my show last week, or indeed any of the previous 25 shows. I'm only going to say this once. Some of you will be relieved to hear, but I was right about everything. Everything that I said came to pass. And ye of little faith, who traduced me, who left my Twitter following, who unfriended me on Facebook, who decided to shoot the messenger rather than listen to the message, are now confounded. And I hope you feel suitably foolish and maybe even ashamed. Everything I said would happen in the British general election last Sunday happened on Thursday, despite the youthquake confidently predicted in the bubble that is Twitter. Despite the pictures of queues of hipsters at the polling stations with iPods in their ear. Turned out, actually, all of those pictures were from just two constituencies in the southwest of London. I could tell by looking at those pictures, but those on Twitter, many of them, many thousands of them, evidently could not, because beyond the M25 in the rain, there were no queues at the polling stations at all. Just a steady stream of people determined to break down what had been Labour's red wall. I predicted to you that Labour would lose dozens, perhaps scores of seats. Well, they lost virtually 3 scores of seats. I predicted that they would lose them in the West Midlands, in the East Midlands, in the North West, in the North East, and in Wales. And so they did. Now, how come I knew that with such certainty, but so many of you were of the view that I was talking through my hat? Wrong hat, by the way, if you've already noticed. I got dressed in the dark. I was not talking through my hat. I was talking through 50 years of political experience and the cold reality of actually talking to people on and beyond that red wall, not talking to them on Twitter, not talking to them on Facebook, but talking to them face to face and looking into their eyes. It didn't have to be this way. So many people got so bored, indeed got into a rage at Boris Johnson's monotonous repetition of a simple mantra. Get Brexit done. But that was an entirely unnecessary dichotomy. That could have been Labour's slogan, should have been Labour's slogan. Labour was the first, Jeremy Corbyn was the first man in Britain, I know because I advised him to, who called on the first day for the triggering of Article 50 and the countdown to leaving the European Union. That should have been Labour's platform. Get Brexit done. Of course, the implication would be that if you elect me, if you elect us, we'll give you a better Brexit than the Tories ever would. But get Brexit done. Implement the decision of the Brexit referendum. Respect the result of the Brexit referendum, which was, after all, the policy which gained Labour 40% of the polls just 2 years ago in the best Labour result since 1945, the biggest increase in the Labour vote since 1945. Why change a winning team? Why change a winning policy? I'll tell you why. Because Jeremy Corbyn was taken hostage. Taken hostage by people who broke his arms, broke his legs, tied them behind his back, worked him from behind and told him to say something radically different. And when I pointed that out to so many former friends of mine, they called it disloyalty. As a matter of fact, it was me that was being loyal. And you who were seeking to camouflage that simple truth, to deny it, who were the ones who were being disloyal. I told you over and over again, I would give you my right arm. And I meant it for Corbyn to be the Prime Minister. But I didn't expect it to happen because Labour's betrayal of Brexit, Labour allowing itself to be boxed into a corner as the anti-Brexit party was going to lose them millions of votes in their traditional heartlands, and all to gain Putney and Canterbury. I mean, I know Shakespeare asked the question, for Wales? Well, Wales is a great deal more valuable than Putney and Canterbury. All of that was done for Labour gains in Putney and Canterbury. Just think about that. Because now that that red wall has been demolished, now that these mining areas, Dennis Skinner, a hero, a titan of the workers' movement, is now an ex-MP, and a Tory sits in Bolsover. A Tory sits in Blythe Valley. A Tory sits in Sedgefield. Well, you could say they've had one before in the form of Mr. Tony Blair. This is a thoroughgoing disaster that will, of course, not be repaired by Labour continuing its arc, its trajectory towards being still more of the North London party. Sir Keir Starmer, Lady Emily Thornberry are the two front runners for the next Labour leader, and faster than Jeremy Corbyn wants. Be sure about that. Here's another prediction. They'll force him out within weeks, not months. These people now have the ball at their feet. They are dragging, metaphorically, some of them would like to do it actually, dragging Jeremy Corbyn through the streets to humiliate and flay him. They are dancing on the grave of the Labour Party that I was born into and grew up in, and which is no more. And if these Blairites take back control of the Labour Party, dig in their love of the European Union, be sure that that red wall will never be rebuilt, and there will be Tories camping on hitherto safe Labour ground for as long as most of us here watching and listening to this show are alive. Boris Johnson ran a campaign of simple genius. He didn't produce a manifesto, a shower, a confetti of promises so vast that no one could even remember a single one of them, so many of them were they. He ran on a, metaphorically speaking, on a single page. Get Brexit done. Implement Brexit. And that's what the people wanted, as you now know, and as I always did. Of course, the tsunami of hatred, masquerading as news, masquerading as journalism, which hit Corbyn every day for more than 4 years, has a very great deal to do with this outcome. But it was made easy for them by mistakes that Corbyn himself made. If he had stood firm from the beginning and insisted on his own definition, the dictionary definition, the accepted definition in the English language of anti-Semitism, and by force of character and repetition, the simple truth that opposition to Israel has nothing to do with antipathy towards Jews. Nothing at all. Instead of running, capitulating, surrendering, throwing his friends under a bus in order to appease a movement that is unappeasable for them, those whose whole purpose in politics is to defend Netanyahu's state of Israel, there is no appeasing of them. There can be no appeasing of them. If he'd thrown all of his friends and his family under that bus, it still would not have appeased them. If he'd started to wear the flag of Israel on his lapel, it would not have appeased them. And of course, that tsunami is now on its way across the Atlantic. Bernie Sanders is now an anti-Semite, don't you know? The fact that he himself is Jewish, that his family perished in the Holocaust, has not stopped the black propagandists from beginning their evil work. And it's now well underway, and we'll be talking about that this evening too. Joe Biden is still the front runner for the Democratic Party's nomination. Imagine that. Imagine how Donald Trump looks forward to facing creepy, sleepy Joe Biden and beating him like a drum. I suppose Joe Biden is the American equivalent of Sir Keir Starmer. Not a bad-looking man, but as wooden as a post. So wooden, the birds are trying to nest in him. Joe Biden is the ideal candidate for Donald Trump to fight. All the others are now falling by the wayside. Elizabeth Warren has reinvented herself yet again, back to being the moderate candidate. She's now playing for a VP slot on Joe Biden's ticket. Only Bernie can beat Donald Trump. That simple truth is as true now as the first time I and many others said so 4 years ago. But is he going to get it? Will the Democratic Party be like the British Labour Party and always take the wrong course? And we'll be talking about Iraq, where the protests, as they were once called, have now become effectively an insurrection. Is Iraq now ungovernable? What will it mean in the region if the current turmoil continues? Who will govern? Are we still seeing, feeling the reverberations of the Bush and Blair attack on Iraq? Now, speaking of Iraq, who would you most like to throw a shoe at? I mention it because that's actually the only justice that George W. Bush has ever faced or will ever face. It's the closest he came when a good man threw both of his shoes quite well at George W. Bush. Though it's got to be said, Bush deftly dodged them. Who would you most like to throw a shoe at? A, Boris Johnson. B, Jeremy Corbyn. C, your choice. You can vote now on my Twitter feed. You can call us, of course. You can email us. You can tweet us at George Galloway at RTUK News. Make sure you at both of us so that they come through in good time to be read out on the show. But above all, I need your calls. I'm sure we'll get calls on all these three subjects, but the British general election will probably prevail. I said I'd only say it once. I'll say it one last time. I told you so. Socialist Tipster on Twitter says on the MOATS poll he'd most like to throw his shoe at Emily Thornberry. Not a bad call, that. And a man who doesn't make bad calls is Matthew Goodwin, Professor of Politics and International Relations. And he's on the line now to talk to me about the general election results. Professor Matthew, thank you for joining us again.
Good evening, George.
Now, you predicted, as I did, the outcome of the general election. Not everyone did, especially people on the left. So if you'd concentrate on what happened to Labour, first of all, I'd appreciate that. Would you kindly summarise what happened to Labour on Thursday?
Well, Labour received its worst election result since 1935. It effectively went backwards in England, Scotland and Wales, and it lost many of its traditional Labour heartlands to the Conservatives, in some cases areas that have never gone Conservative before. So the Labour Party really did experience a seismic shock. And also, George, I think what's most interesting perhaps is that Labour experienced its sharpest declines in the most strongly working class districts. And that would suggest to me that Labour has really lost touch with the very communities that it was founded to represent.
Indeed, I was making the point earlier that all of the Brexit sacrifice was made to gain Putney and Canterbury, or hold Canterbury and gain Putney. It's not much of a bargain, that, is it, to lose the Blythe Valley and Bolsover to gain Putney?
Well, I think Labour's been pulled in two different directions. I think its electorate has really now become structurally unsound, in the sense that we have lots of Labour MPs that really have more life common experiences, more affinities with Hampstead than they do with Hartlepool. And I think as a consequence, many voters cottoned onto that. I think this has been a long time coming. I think after 2001, we began to see in the data working class voters leaving politics, not voting at all. And then many of those voters would actually come back into politics to vote for Brexit in 2016. Some of them voted for Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party. And then what we saw on Thursday were large numbers of those voters essentially swinging instead behind Boris Johnson and the Conservatives. And this is, I think, especially damning for the current Labour Party, given that a Conservative leader who's passed through Eton and Oxford and is for many people the very embodiment of a wealthy elite, has with ease, it appears, converted some of the oldest Labour seats in the country, and that should worry the Labour Party.
I said earlier in my introduction, this was an unnecessary dichotomy, because Corbyn was the first man to call for the triggering of Article 50. He had spent his whole life, I was sitting next to him for most of it, being against the EU. He was the first to call for the triggering of Article 50, and he stood in 2017 on a manifesto that said we would respect the result of the referendum. So get Brexit done could actually have been Jeremy Corbyn's slogan in the election, couldn't it?
Well, I think there is an interesting difference between 2017 and 2019. As you say, in 2017, Corbyn was essentially respecting people's desires, or the referendum result, respecting that option to leave the European Union, and also to reform freedom of movement. And fast forward to 2019, and Labour were essentially saying they wanted a second referendum and would campaign to remain, and that they wouldn't make any changes to freedom of movement. And I think, over the last year, we've heard a lot of people on Twitter and elsewhere saying that that's exactly where the Labour Party should have moved. And some of us were warning that actually that would really pull the rug from underneath the Labour Party. And now we're left looking at the largest Conservative majority since 1987 and the highest share of the vote for the Conservatives since 1979. So I think a lot of people out there have got a lot of things wrong, and I think they've misdiagnosed where the Labour Party is and ultimately the voters that the Labour Party needs.
Well, don't tempt me to name those who got them wrong, but the early signs are, I looked at the bookies' prices before coming on air, that Labour's answer, or the bookmakers' expectation of Labour's answer to the failure of the current Labour leadership is to pick one or other of two North London MPs, both of them fanatic EU Remain advocates.
Well, the way that I would describe the Labour challenge at the moment, I've finished reading some of the work by the French economist Thomas Piketty, who, of course, wrote quite extensively about the rise of inequality across advanced democracies. And Piketty's thesis with regards to left-wing parties is that they have effectively been hijacked by what he would call the Brahmin left, socially liberal, often economically liberal, university graduates from the cities and the university towns who have little common experience with some of the communities that their parties were founded to represent, and that has left a massive opening for populist parties and now also for conservative parties. And I have a lot of sympathy with that account, given that it's what we're witnessing in British politics, it's what we're seeing play out. The ease with which the Conservatives went into seats like Redcar and Bishop Auckland and Bolsover should worry Labour, because once people make that switch and once they give up those tribal allegiances, it's incredibly difficult to get them to go back the other way. And it becomes credible, it becomes legitimate to continue to vote for non-Labour options. And I think that's what worries me. And the Labour Party debate, George, as you say, I think has been woefully inadequate. Already we're talking about leaders, and we're not talking about ideas. And the Labour Party needs to get back to talking about ideas and why it's fundamentally become disconnected from these voters. And a leader isn't going to solve that.
It's not even just economic ideas, is it? Because actually some of the policies, my criticism would be the sheer number of them, the confetti approach of showering policies in their manifesto, but things like public ownership of rail, of water, and so on, by most opinion polls, are really quite heavily supported amongst the British population. Isn't it more to do with the which Piketty is identifying? These are culture war issues, aren't they? I said here last Sunday that for most working class people, certainly in the North, in the Midlands and North, Labour doesn't look like them anymore, doesn't talk like them, doesn't think like them, doesn't live like them, has a set of values which aren't their values. These cultural questions are really profound, and there's no sign of Labour either rethinking those matters or being in a position to do it. If you were to say to me now, give me a candidate from the Midlands or the North who could represent a new direction, a third way, you might say, I'd struggle to even name one, never mind name a couple, that would be capable of carrying that standard. These cultural questions are important, aren't they?
I think they're incredibly critical. And I think the debate that we're having now across many democracies is what really is in the driving seat. Is it these economic questions over redistribution, or is it these cultural questions over values and identities and people's feeling of belonging? And for a long time, a lot of people on the left remained very rigidly attached to the idea that the only thing that matters is economic redistribution. And I think what we've discovered over the last 10 years in politics, or at least my thesis at least, is that of course that's important, it's absolutely critical, but actually alongside that are some pretty independent but equally intense concerns over national borders, security, ways of life, national traditions. And, you know, Orwell made this point in the 1940s, 1950s, that people's attachment to the nation is an incredibly powerful, potent emotion, and something that probably has no other rival in politics. And political parties can either learn how to navigate around that, or they can ignore it and dismiss it, and ultimately feel the consequences of doing so. And I think Labour's position at this election sent a message to many working class voters that while they were on their side economically, they didn't respect their patriotism, they didn't respect their ways of life, they weren't particularly concerned with how they view the European Union, how they view the nation, how they view their home. And as a consequence, they abandoned the Labour Party in droves. And George, you've seen it as well as I have. Social media over the last 18 months has been full of people saying, leave those communities, urging the Labour Party to turn to Hampstead and give up on Hartlepool. And the consequence of that strategy was underlined by the results coming in the early hours of Friday morning. It was disastrous, completely disastrous.
This is summed up in the if you'll recall, the Emily Thornberry tweet about the England flag, white van man with his England flag. Many people in the Labour Party would be far more comfortable holding the flag of Bolivia or Venezuela than they would a flag of their own country, whereas left-wing people in France or in Spain, both imperialist countries historically, would have absolutely no qualms whatsoever with their national flag. So the patriotism issue is important. The people, working class people we're talking about, felt that Labour had more in common with, certainly more love for, the European Union than they did for their own country.
Well, we've heard a lot of discussion of Clement Attlee during the Corbyn reign. I think Clement Attlee was fundamentally a patriot, somebody who talked about his love of the country, somebody who recognised what Orwell referred to as the sort of social mood in the country. And I think the problem for the Labour Party today is that, as reflected in Emily Thornberry and other elite candidates who have been parachuted in to represent working class constituencies, is that that link has become fundamentally broken. And people keep telling me that this is like 1983. George, I think it's a lot worse than 1983. I think Labour in 1983 held much of Scotland. It held many of its heartlands. Today, it's being chased out of both, and it doesn't seem to know where its electoral alliance is. And, that is deeply worrying for a political party that just went up against a governing party that's been in office for nearly a decade.
Yeah.
This is inexcusable.
A decade of austerity at that.
Well, exactly. And an economic squeeze and a highly divisive debate over Britain's place in the world. And you put all of that together, and it's incredible that a main opposition party, which should otherwise be a progressive international party, walked away with its worst performance since 1935.
Now, I'd love to speak to you all night, but you're a very busy man. May I ask you just one more question? The biggest takeaway after the ones we've just been talking about is the constitutional crisis, which is pregnant in the election results with Scotland. The Scottish National Party swept the boards, virtually winning almost all the parliamentary seats. They now claim that as a mandate for a second independence referendum. That is after the one that was a once-in-a-lifetime referendum just 5 years ago. Are they going to get that? How is Boris Johnson going to handle that nascent constitutional crisis, which could actually see us leaving the European Union and losing half of our country?
Well, as Boris Johnson seemed to allude to today, I don't think we're going to have a referendum in Scotland anytime soon. I think the Conservative Party will push that back as long as they can. I think also the SNP is going to be distracted during much of the early part of 2020 with the Alex Salmond trial. I think that will be potentially quite damaging for the SNP. And I think the Conservatives will be hoping that by delivering in some of their key areas and by drawing attention to what they feel is a very weak record of the SNP in Scotland domestically, that they'll be able to continue to make more ground up north of the border, and that by the time we get to the end of Boris Johnson's administration, that perhaps the Scottish independence issue will have perhaps not been as potent as it feels that it is at the moment. So I think there are a lot of things that can change. I think we know the fundamentals. We know we're in for a global slowdown over the next few years. We know that the British economy might be caught up in that, and we know that in general we've got a Conservative administration that's more interested in appealing to non-London areas, really is more interested than any other Conservative administration we've had in a long time. So I think that's going to have some unpredictable effects. And I think it's just it's simply a case, George, of watch this space. I think it's too early to say one way or the other what exactly is going to happen. But right now, don't forget, the Labour Party in Scotland reduced to 1 seat. And that reminds us, never forget how quickly political change can happen, and never forget how quickly a political party can be wiped out in rather large areas of the country.
Professor Matthew Goodwin, thank you kindly for your time and your expertise. I really appreciate that. That's Matthew Goodwin. You had, and we're spoiling you, you had Professor Sir John Curtis last week, Professor Matthew Goodwin, Professor of Politics and International Relations. This week, the two finest psephologists, political scientists alive in the English-speaking world today, in my opinion. I said earlier that if you'd listened to me last Sunday, you already knew the results of the general election. I took an even bigger flyer. In my short for RT 3 days before the general election. And with uncanny accuracy, everything I said turned out to be true. Take a look. The British general election is ending exactly as it began. The air is thick with allegations that the Russians are coming. In the beginning, believe it or not, it was Labour alleging that Boris Johnson and the Conservatives were in the pay of the Russians. It's ending with the allegation, now coming from every spook source in the land, that somehow the Russians managed to give Jeremy Corbyn details of Britain's trade discussions with Donald Trump's administration for the post-Brexit era. Neither allegation, of course, is true, but it's a measure of just how magnificent a figure this Vladimir Putin has turned out to be. He picked the last American president and is trying to pick the next one. He rigged the Brexit referendum. He created a national movement in Catalonia. He even tried to break Scotland off from London. All the while, running rather an important and large country at the same time. There is no end to the talents of the magician in the Kremlin. All of the foregoing was, of course, a joke. And so are these allegations. The truth is, the election is ending as it begun, with the Tories very considerably ahead. In the Sunday papers, in the largest poll, you might say, therefore, the most authoritative poll, the Conservatives are 15 points clear, and Labour is heading for a 1983-style heavy defeat, at which point its leader, Jeremy Corbyn, presumably walks to be replaced by the man that's been operating him for months, the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell. But if JC were to win, it would be, quite frankly, a miracle, and he'd be able to walk across the Thames, ascend the wall into the Parliament House as Britain's first ever socialist, anti-imperialist Prime Minister. It would be extraordinary that an entitled oaf like Boris Johnson could become a majority Prime Minister, the wisest fool in Christendom, overeducated but underwise. Labour will have lost of their own doing. Labour's U-turn on the Brexit issue has lost them. I'm absolutely certain. Dozens, maybe scores of seats behind what used to be called the Red Wall in the Midlands, in the Northwest, in the Northeast, and in South Wales. Amongst working class people in Britain, there's a feeling, I'm here to tell you, for I experience it every single day, that Labour now neither looks, sounds, or is like them. It's a kind of culture war issue. Working class people do not believe that the metropolitan, middle class, university educated Labour Party of today has anything very much to do with them. General election 2019 will also mark my words, the beginning of the end of the so-called mainstream British media. I see no justification for paying to be lied to, and the British people have been lied to in a deluge, in a tsunami of lies and distortion about the personalities and the policies and the general approach of both of these main parties. And my final word is this: those of you who were up in arms going to the High Court to stop the prorogation of the last Parliament will be begging for the next Parliament to be prorogued. Because, trust me on this, another 5 years of majority Tory government led by Boris Johnson is not going to be nice to look at.
Have something to say? Do you disagree with George? Then call us now and give us your view.
Well, unbelievably, the audience for this point in the evening is 66% higher than the average. How about that then? And the poll, who would you most like to throw a shoe at? Boris Johnson, 51%. Jeremy Corbyn, 34%. And your choice, 15%. And there's all kinds of those coming up on my Twitter feed. Someone says it'd have to be a very big shoe to hit multiple targets. Someone else says Benjamin Netanyahu any day of the week. Emily Thornberry's getting plenty of shoes hurled in her direction. You can also call me on this if you'd like. Anyway, I've got a call from Halifax in England. That's from Carol. At least I assume Halifax in England. Carol, go ahead.
It's actually Hebden Bridge, George. Good evening. And
good evening to you. It's just that it occurred to me that I had spoken in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and I thought for a minute you were one of my audience from there. Go ahead, Carol. Go ahead in Hebden Bridge.
Oh, George, I just wanted to say, yeah, you got it spot on about... I'm a lifelong Labour voter that actually voted for a Tory MP, I'm afraid to say. On Thursday, I've completely been disenfranchised with the Labour Party now for a long time.
What were your main problems with it, Carol?
Gosh, where do I start? I thought the manifesto in certain parts was fantastic. I mean, I'm really pro the renationalisation, for instance, of the utilities. I think that's absolutely a vote winner right across the board. I'm a regular train user. I have to go. It's just horrendous what's going on with the trains at the moment. But what was my main problem with Labour? I do not feel that Corbyn has any empathy with the working man in the UK. I also feel that the absolute constant pre-provocation on Brexit was a disgrace. As you've mentioned before, I watched Legsit, which is a fantastic film, by the way, and everybody should watch it.
Thank you.
The traditional, I think, Labour position on leaving the EU was leaving the EU. I was absolutely horrified to hear that the fact that they were going to have another referendum on that. I just genuinely thought it was just been utter disaster, business-wise as well. I work in the private sector. There was genuine concerns as well. I work for a company that publishes news for the creative sector, a creative sector that traditionally supports Labour, but there was genuine horror about the broadband and the taxation, and I just feel very disenfranchised from the party, and there's just a lot of concern, George. It's very hard to put your finger on exactly what it is, but I don't.
Are you saying this was the first time that you have ever voted Conservative?
Completely.
Did you feel any sense of guilt or regret or even shame about that?
Not really, no, because I just don't feel that Labour was worth putting my cross against, and there was no other party, there was no Green candidate. No, I don't. I actually honestly think if Labour had got in, it would have been a disaster, George. I just don't feel it was. They have a coherent policy for the UK at the moment.
Well, it's
which
a very
really scares me.
Yeah,
it really does.
Very interesting call, Carol, and thank you for making it. I mentioned Canada. Now we have one from Calgary, Fraser, who sounds like he's of Scottish descent. Go ahead, Fraser.
Hello, George. It's a pleasure to speak to you.
And to you. You're not just of Scottish descent, you're the real deal.
That's it. West Coast indeed. So I was just phoning because obviously the general election was an absolute disaster for Labour. As a young voter myself, I've only ever voted Labour in my life, but I'll tell you this time took a real holding of the nose, shall we say. And after everything that's happened, I guess I just feel a bit left and disillusioned because, my God, I can't stand the Scottish Nationalist Party either. But it looks like they're.
I think there are millions. I think there are millions of people like you, and including, of course, those that didn't hold their nose but crossed the floor, like Carol in Halifax. So there's millions who did vote Labour, but did so in a way against their better judgment, and certainly against their inner feelings. And of course, there are millions that actually didn't. Some of them, like Carol, for the first time. What were your main problems with Labour?
Well, the main problem is, against my better judgment, I started off as a Remainer, and then as soon as the referendum came through, as a real Democrat of the left, I said, well, let's get on with it. And then ever since then, it's just been abuse and abuse on the left.
Well, I'm so glad you made that point, Fraser, because I was going to make that point to Professor Goodwin, but we were running out of time. It's not just that so many Labour people had drunk the Kool-Aid of the European Union. It's their predisposition to abuse, insult, libel those of us who didn't drink the Kool-Aid. We're racists. We're even fascists. We're chauvinists, xenophobes. No insult base enough was too much for them. And that kind of abuse actually, well, I could show you my scars, Fraser. It's really very hard to take, especially when thee and me have turned out to have been proven entirely correct. So,
yeah, no, absolutely. It's going to be a tough few years ahead, but I think I'll tell you one thing. I'm definitely not going to bow down to the nationalists that are trying to recruit the Remainers of the left.
Yeah.
I'll tell you one thing. That's one party I won't be a part of, for sure.
Well, I look forward to fighting Nicola Sturgeon's next referendum, because I believe that it is hopelessly overestimated how much love the Scottish people have for the European Union, especially when the campaign begins and all the consequences of Scotland making application to rejoin the European Union are spelled out. Consequences of currency, consequences of trading relations with England, consequences of freedom of movement, of cheap East European labour into Scotland, all the people that can no longer get into England going to Scotland, the need to build a wall because if you don't, they'll be climbing over the border to get into England. All of these consequences are hopelessly underestimated by the people that imagine that the Scots are going to vote easily for separation. I don't believe that they will. Fraser, thanks. An excellent call, my friend. Dave is in Dover. Let's hear from him. Dave, welcome.
Hi.
Hi.
Well, I've also voted Labour all my life. I'm 50 years old now, and there's only one reason. It was a referendum. If you're going to go against the majority, then it isn't a democracy, and it's as simple as that. And it's a shame because he had the opportunity. All he needed to do was, in the beginning, stand up and say, I don't want to be in the European Union, but I'm in the Labour Party, so I'm going with what the majority say, and fought against the second referendum.
I did fight against it. Dave, not everybody knows, but I'm in a position to know that Corbyn actually fought these hijackers all the way. The problem is he only did so inside a closed room. None of the rest of the country were ever told this.
And that's the main problem about everything. I mean, it goes back to who's controlling the media, because all we've got is sound bites all the time. And people have... unfortunately, now I'm disabled. I broke my back, broke my neck, so I can't work anymore. So I've got more time to actually look at what's really going on. But when I used to work, the only thing I could do was watch the news and then read a quick read of the paper and then get back to work. So you get the information that you're given, and that's what your world revolves around. And you don't notice that actually there's no coverage of Jeremy Corbyn. When it is, it's taking the mickey out of him. He's got some good ideas. Anti-Zionism, for example, is pathetic. There's no way he's anti-Zionist. And anti-Zionism...
Well, he's certainly not anti-Semitic, which is what they further claimed.
And it actually means anti-Arabic. It's nothing to do with Jews, but it's another soundbite.
Leaving that aside.
They use the sound bites to make a point.
Well, they're now doing it against Bernie Sanders in the United States. Dave, thanks for the call. Sorry I have to cut you short. Scott is in Glasgow. Go ahead, Scott.
Yes, hello, George. Just 3 points here. I mean, it's not just 10 years of Tory propaganda. It's not even 40. It's 400. I mean, 400 years of colonial instilling of I'm better than you, and at the same time hundreds of years of conditioned working class forelock tugging. I mean, obviously going against the Brexit vote was a deliberate sabotage by the Blairites. They have all the resources to get inside millions of people's heads. You know,
I think they knew, Scott, what the outcome would be. They wanted it.
Of course. Yeah, well, of course, yeah, that's what I'm saying.
They never wanted Corbyn to be the PM.
They never wanted it, no. And they know what they're doing before they even... They know what the people are going to do before they've even done it themselves, you know. Obviously, it's the brought-up media as well. But I mean, back to my first point, you know, the ember, I think, of ember of racism, I have to say, is within a lot of British people. I know I'm going to get a lot of backlash for that. I mean, it only took the oxygen of austerity to ignite that. I mean, I've seen it. I'm mixed race. I've lived it. I mean, Brexit, as big as it was, it couldn't have ignited something that was not already burning. And
I mean, Britain, with its imperial history, obviously has... Yes. You can't have an empire if you don't think you're superior to the people you're colonising. But it's not nearly as racist as most of the countries of the European Union. If you think Britain's racist, you've never lived in France, as they say, Scott.
I haven't lived in France, but I've lived in other European countries, and I can see that. I mean, in some European countries, it was until recently. I would describe it as being like Britain in the 70s or even like the 50s. Until now, and people are saying, "Well, is this worse than the Thatcher years?" Yes, this is worse now. When you get people, what you can see in some of these European countries.
Can I just ask you something, because this is quite important? it's oftentimes said that Scotland doesn't have racism, all this civic nationalism and all of that. But you're saying that racism in Glasgow, in Scotland, is worse than it was than in the Thatcher era.
No. I'm saying across Britain. I'm saying in, I mean, the places that not particularly Glasgow, although it has its pockets. What I'm saying is the places that Labour lost, it didn't take much to ignite what was already there. Now, anyone of colour, I'm going to say, will know what I'm talking about there. It never went away, George, and it only took. I mean, this stuff is kept bubbling under for when it's needed. It was needed now. When austerity came, who do we blame? So this I'm better than you, this instilling of I'm better than you is kept, this empirical notion is kept there. The ember is kept there, and then it's stoked up when needed, and it's been stoked up because it's needed now.
Scott, as you said, your contribution has been controversial. I'm sure many people will want to respond to it. Thanks very much, though, for making it. Alistair is in Lincolnshire. Let's hear from him next. Alistair.
Good evening, George.
Good evening, sir.
I was telling your researcher that I watched the Labour Party conference this year, and after it I was absolutely stunned because I couldn't believe that they were actually going to put such an extreme left-wing set of policies to the British electorate. Now, don't get me wrong, in most cases I actually support those policies.
But it wasn't, Alistair, I'll come back to you, Alistair, of course. But was it more left-wing than the one in 2017 that got 40% of the vote? If so, in which ways?
I think it was, wasn't it more left-wing in terms of certainly the amount of money they were proposing?
Yeah, probably. I haven't counted that up, but it probably was a bigger spend, yeah.
I just think that the nationalisation programme, they should have slowed down.
I don't know, Alistair, he put that forward in the last election and it did fantastically well.
Yeah, well, some of the nationalisations are very popular, no doubt. But what I'm saying is generally is that they should have taken a better strategic view coming to this election and actually sort of position themselves between the sort of right wing of the Labour Party and where they are there, sort of in the middle, and not so much so.
Isn't that what Gordon? But didn't Gordon Brown try that in 2010? Ed Miliband in 2015. I mean, Corbyn got more votes than Tony Blair's last election victory, Gordon Brown's election defeat, and Ed Miliband's election defeat. Even bad though Labour's vote was, it was bigger than any of those three.
Well, yeah, I agree. I think that Gordon Brown and Ed Miliband weren't as extreme as, or weren't as left-wing as Jeremy Corbyn was.
No, and they got lesser votes, which is my point.
Yes, absolutely. But what I'm saying is that it got to the point where I don't think the British public believed that. Because, I mean, we've had.
No, I think you're onto something there. It's the believability of Labour's promises, which is, for me, a bigger issue than the quantum, because I'm not sure that most people would say, oh, no, we're spending too much money. They want to know what the money's being spent on. Is it being invested or is it being thrown away on a garden bridge, as Boris Johnson once proposed here in London? I think it's the believability issue. If we can't believe you on Brexit, how can we believe you that none of us will be paying very much more tax? That believability issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So did you vote Labour?
I did vote Labour, yeah. I mean, my question, I heard one of the callers earlier saying that she normally votes for Labour but went to the Tories. Yeah. Can I just ask, I mean, a general question? Yeah. To all those same people who did that, do they actually believe that life is going to be better under Boris Johnson?
Well,
I get quite angry about it.
Of course, it's not something I could even imagine in my wildest dreams myself. I suppose her answer would be, well, at the very least, we'll get Brexit done. And that should have been Labour's policy. That's my point.
Well, I agree, even though that's going to be a disaster, of course, as well. So, yeah, I mean, I agree that they should have said it. I agree with you on that.
OK, look, Alistair, it's been a pleasure talking to you. We don't get that many calls from Lincolnshire, so don't be a stranger. Call back. Now, the Grey Zone Project is the best journalistic outfit operating in the United States today. Forget the Washington Post, the New York Times, forget Fox News or CNN. The Grey Zone people are where it's at. Many of my good friends are working there and foundation members of it. And Ben Norton is their assistant editor. And I'm glad to say he joins me now. Ben, thank you very much for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Before we get into Donald Trump's travails, can I ask you something that I think is going to become a much bigger story than it even is at this moment? We've just lived through 4 years of the crucifixion of Jeremy Corbyn on the entirely false allegation that he is somehow anti-Semitic. I now believe, and I interviewed on this show, although on a different platform, quite some time ago now, someone who predicted that the attack on Corbyn on this front was going to be used, it was a trial run really, for its use against Bernie Sanders. The fact that Sanders is himself Jewish would not, he said, be an obstacle to that. Can you tell me how that's looking? Is that looking more and more likely as a serious line of attack on Sanders?
Absolutely. We've seen more and more that the same tactics used to try to destroy and to successfully destroy Jeremy Corbyn and his progressive movement in the UK have been repurposed against the first major Jewish presidential candidate in the US. And like you said, that might seem very striking to people, but actually it shows how this is a political weapon. It confirms the point that Corbyn supporters were saying from the very beginning, that this was all a witch hunt, that it was not based on actual anti-Semitism, of which Boris Johnson is actually an example. He is much more anti-Semitic than Jeremy Corbyn, who has actually fought racism his entire life. And similarly with Bernie Sanders, this is a guy who is himself Jewish. And also, unlike Corbyn, Bernie has a very mixed record on Israel-Palestine. He has spoken out in support of Palestinian rights, and that's very important. But actually, his record is not nearly as noble as that of Jeremy Corbyn. But they're still going to use it because it's a political weapon. It's not based on any truth. And it's a political weapon that is not only backed by the Israel lobby, but more importantly, by intelligence services. And just as we saw with the smear campaign for more than 4 years against Corbyn, this was a full frontal attack backed by domestic British intelligence agencies, American intelligence agencies, and other foreign intelligence agencies. This is not just speculation. The British journalist Matt Kennard, who's quite good, actually published a report documenting at least 34 major media attacks on Jeremy Corbyn and his Labour Party that were directly based on supposed intel from British and American intelligence agencies. This was very clear. In the last week, they went into hyperdrive, smearing him as a terrorist sympathizer, an anti-Semite, all of these things. And they're going to repurpose these same smears, not just the corporate media, but intelligence agencies, to try to destroy Bernie Sanders. They're going to go after him, for instance, because Bernie took a trip to the Soviet Union on his honeymoon, because Bernie supported the Sandinistas. And unfortunately, in the past several decades, since the end of the Cold War, since the overthrow of many socialist governments, Bernie has kind of moved away from that kind of anti-imperialist stance that he used to embody more strongly. But still, for the neoliberal establishment, if you're to the left of Hillary Clinton, you're too left-wing, and they're going to try to do everything they can to destroy him.
Yeah, he may have moved away from these things, but the video and the pictures and the newspaper cuttings all still exist. So they will, of course, try to resurrect them. But as you say, this is a man who is Jewish, whose family members, some of them perished in the Holocaust, and who is actually a Zionist, a supporter of Israel. He's a critic, of course, of Israeli crimes, but he is in no sense someone who questions the legitimacy of the existence of a Zionist state. You still think that, notwithstanding all of that, this could get traction?
Absolutely, because it simply confirms the point I was just stressing, that this is not about anti-Semitism. It's not even necessarily about criticism of Israel. I mean, that's certainly part of it, but this is simply a blunt political weapon that right-wing forces and intelligence agencies and the corporate media are all colluding and using to destroy left-wing forces. It is so clear that this is the new tactic. Even if you still support Israel, as Bernie does, even if, this is a soft Zionist, even if you still are a soft Zionist, if you criticize the apartheid regime that is called Israel, if you criticize its war crimes in Gaza, as Bernie has done, that is too much for this right-wing military intelligence establishment, because Israel is simply a symbol of imperialism and colonialism. Israel is one of the last remaining European-style settler colonial projects in the heart of the Middle East, and it has been a bastion first for British imperialism and now for American imperialism. They spend billions of dollars to help fuel the American military-industrial complex. They work closely with Western militaries and NATO militaries. They helped wage the war on Syria. They want to destroy Iran and all progressive resistance forces in the Middle East. So if you oppose that project, even in a minor way, even if you're not fully against it, for the military and intelligence establishment that really dominates politics in all of these so-called democracies, these imperialist institutions that were created after World War II to maintain European and American hegemony and capitalist control over the world. If you oppose even one part of one cog in this larger machine, then they're going to use this smear because it's a political weapon. It's not true. It's not about racism. It's not about anti-Semitism. In fact, Donald Trump himself is actually anti-Semitic. Just a week ago, he told Jewish supporters, oh, you're going to support me because you have money. Everyone knows Jews have money. He is actually anti-Semitic, but they don't care because Donald Trump is fully on board with Zionism, with imperialism, with wars, even though he says he's been criticizing them. So,
on that point, Ben, I mean, and yet, these very same agencies, part of the deep state in the United States, have also been trying, have they not, to destroy Donald Trump.
Well, yes, there are different splits within it, of course. So Donald Trump has completely thrown his weight behind apartheid Israel. He recognized Jerusalem as the supposed capital, which is, of course, illegal under international law. He's working very closely with the most far-right elements of the Israeli apartheid regime. So there's no question of that. But it is true that for other reasons, elements of these same military intelligence agencies have also been trying to unseat Trump. Why? A few reasons. Of course, because he doesn't see Russia as the enemy, as the big boogeyman. So Israel is just one, like I said, Israel is one cog in this larger imperialist machine. Trump is on board with Israel, but he's not on board with war against Russia. He, until recently, was criticizing NATO, although we've seen that he's completely taken a 180 and now supports NATO. And also simply because Trump is not reliable. He's not a reliable imperialist in the same way many of these other leaders have been. He, for instance, supported the peace deal with North Korea, and until it was really sabotaged by some of the same neoconservatives that he surrounded himself with, specifically John Bolton, Trump has pursued a somewhat unorthodox foreign policy. It's not all war and regime change. He has, in some cases, supported peace and diplomacy. And for the military-industrial complex, any peace and diplomacy is too much.
He hasn't started a new war, and by year 3 of a first term, that's quite remarkable.
Well, we'll see. I mean, he's, of course, done a lot of saber rattling. And I agree that compared to Hillary Clinton, who probably just would have destroyed the state of Syria, it is quite refreshing to see that Trump hasn't waged an entirely new military war. But at the same time, we should keep in mind that he has drastically expanded economic war. Sure. He imposed a crippling blockade on Venezuela, which has led to at least 40,000 civilian deaths. So he hasn't been dropping bombs on Venezuela, but he's been killing large numbers of civilians in Venezuela. Of course, the sanctions on Iran. So it's true that it's good to see that Trump hasn't waged a new military war, although it looks like he might try to do something with Iran. At the same time, the economic war is just as deadly.
How is he faring in the last vestiges of Russiagate, which has now morphed into Ukrainegate? Are they going to get their impeachment motion through, do you think?
Well, potentially through the House, but of course the impeachment proceeding is going to completely stop dead in its tracks in the Senate. It's never going to pass the Senate, but House Democrats will use this as a short-term political cudgel to attack Trump. You know, we've been talking about this for many months, George, and I actually think, unfortunately, this is going to backfire and blow up in the faces of Democrats, as it has with Russiagate. You know, these are the final withdrawals of Russiagate, which has morphed into Ukrainegate. We've seen that neoliberal centrist Democrats, just like the Blairites, who destroyed the potential for Labour to win in the UK, they are potentially destroying the potential for the Democrats to win against Donald Trump here. If you look at his ratings in polls, they actually haven't really declined. And all this has done is helped embolden Donald Trump's base and confirmed these points that he's been saying, that it's been a witch hunt against him. You know, progressive critics like me and many others have been saying from the very beginning that we should be criticizing Trump for, like I said, the economic warfare against Venezuela, the genocidal war that began under Obama that he has continued overseeing in Yemen that has led to hundreds of thousands of deaths, the fact that he's occupying Syria's sovereign oil wells. These are the issues that Democrats agree on. In fact, Democrats just gave him exactly. And Democrats, in fact, the vast majority of House Democrats just sided with House Republicans and gave Trump a $738 billion military budget. So instead, they're wasting all of their time on this temporary partisan attack in impeachment proceedings where the Republicans support Trump and the Democrats attack Trump, and they're trying to find this incendiary short-term political issue to ignite both of their bases and distract from the fact that all of Trump's worst crimes are supported by the majority of the right-wing Democratic establishment.
You're quite a considerable star, Ben Norton. Thank you again for a brilliant tour de force of an interview. From the Grey Zone Project, everyone follow them. Grey Zone, Max Blumenthal, Ben Norton, Anya Parampil, all brilliant, brilliant journalists and brave ones too, facing up to some considerable personal difficulties, both abroad and in the United States. I'm joined by Ask Adam, hashtag Ask Adam, lots of hashtag Ask Adam questions there. And we've also got a second poll, I think, coming up. What was your Portillo moment of the night on Thursday night, Friday morning? You know, the moment you were waiting up for, or the moment that gave you the greatest joy, or even, I suppose, the greatest sadness. Whose defeat, whose political defeat or victory was most powerful for you? People always remember the moment that that Michael Portillo lost. So they've become known as Portillo moments. So here's the options. What was your Portillo moment? A, Joe Swinson. B, Chuka Omuna, spelt wrongly. C, Anna Soubry, or Sober, as I call her. I used to say she was better before breakfast. Joe Swinson, Chuka Amuna, or Anna Soubry. You can vote now on my Twitter feed. Which moment gave you the greatest satisfaction when the results were known? Well, Adam, it's been quite a week.
It certainly has been.
I've no need to ask you if you're pleased with the outcome.
Well, no, it was lovely seeing the people in Labour's hotlands giving the sweet, sweet fly swat of destiny to what I call the Islington Mafia. So, and now we've got Christmas coming up, and I think I've got some Christmas reading, which is always nice, which is your book, your first novel, not your first book,
yeah,
but your first novel.
It's pre-ordering tonight, actually. It's just been...
A war story.
Yeah. It's my first novel. I've written lots of books, but novels are a particular challenge.
They're a different animal, yeah.
They're definitely a different animal. It's taken me a long time, but I've now written 2, so that it's a series. So part 1 is out now. You can pre-order it now. I think it's info at georgegalloway.com, or you see it on my Twitter. I'm really happy with the cover. I think
it's lovely.
The cover is a thing of real beauty. Yeah, it's counterfactual history. What if? I've always been fascinated by that genre.
Indeed.
If this had happened rather than that, or the path not taken had been taken, and so its fiction is that Dunkirk has failed, that 300,000 of our men are roaming. Some are in captivity, but others are roaming, armed. In German-occupied France, but the admirals have betrayed us. And there were quite a few admirals, and I named some of them in the novel, who were Hitler fans, who were fascists. The admirals have betrayed us, and Hitler has made it across the Channel. And he has occupied London, parts of the southeast, but he doesn't occupy South Wales or the Midlands, and far less Scotland. And that's where the resistance begins. Well, it begins in London, in the East End of London, actually, but its heartland is in South Wales, the Midlands, the North, and Scotland, where the Nazis are not here yet in enough numbers to properly garrison more than the castles in these areas. And so Mr. Churchill had pledged to resist them until he choked on his own blood. And you'll see in the novel whether or not I think he would have done, and if he had, what the impact would have been. So it was Britain's darkest hour, but also the dawn of resistance. I'm really pleased with it. I hope people like it, and I hope I get the chance to publish the second part. It'll probably be 3, 4, maybe 5 parts, because once you start on this
You're not going to want to put it down.
You don't want to put it down because, of course, if this happened instead of that, well, that has all kinds of consequent knock-on effects.
Are you going to do an audio version?
Yeah, I think I will. I mean, this is a print version now. I'm going to sign them, certainly the pre-order copies. Then I'll do an e-book version. And then probably ultimately I'll do an audio in my own voice.
Brilliant.
Some people like my own voice.
I think so.
Anyway, I wanted to ask you something about the election, not the obvious thing, perhaps the thing that nobody else is thinking about at the minute. Why did Nigel Farage get it all so wrong? I mean, in one sense, you could say that Brexit's going to get done, so his work is done. And that's true, and you have to take your hat off to him for the role he played in that. But he has actually destroyed his party by the cockamamie election strategy that he followed, and they died on Thursday night, surely.
It was, yeah, I don't think that we're going to see a Brexit party after the end of January when Brexit now is going to happen, because there's no parliamentary minority to get stymied by Gina Miller and her other gang of merry men, women and other grim ones. I think what the Brexit party should have done was sit this election out, and unlike Nicola Sturgeon, who's the first Scot to take both the high road and the low road simultaneously, some will we'll get the reference.
Very well said.
What Farage and the Brexit Party should have done is take a high road and say, look, most of the key and natural constituents of the Brexit Party are willing to give Boris the benefit of the doubt, and more so. And so should we. We're going to sit back, encourage people to vote for a leaver, which 9 times out of 10 would have been the Conservative candidate, and then we'll wait. If Boris fails, we'll come back with conscience clean, and if he succeeds, we'll all partake of the champagne-filled swimming pool in Mallorca together. Instead, they stood for seats where they, in the words of your favourite singer, Bob Dylan, you don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. People in these constituencies, they like the Brexit Party, they like Nigel Farage, but they also really like Boris Johnson. And in the system that we live in, that all the people voting know that we live in, they thought, look, we're not going to throw our vote away on a new party. We're going to vote for the Conservatives. And they did.
In fact, the only real impact that he made was save a number of Labour MPs, some of them quite prominent. I mean, I think he saved Yvette Cooper. He saved Ed Miliband. He saved the guy in Hartlepool.
Yeah?
I mean, Richard Tice got 11,000, and the Tory got, I think, a couple of thousand more than that.
Yeah.
And the Labour guy got back in.
They let him in through the back door, absolutely. And the danger that a lot of people on the pro-Brexit Conservative side were worried about was that this could have been repeated throughout the North and the Midlands. It wasn't obviously. It was in these handfuls. But there's no doubt in my mind, and I think in most people's minds, that if there wasn't a Brexit party in places like Hartlepool, in places wherever Cooper's seat is, that you'd have a Tory candidate. So Boris would have had ostensibly 5 more MPs in his majority than he does.
Yeah, not that he needs them, of course, and not that Labour actually needs some of those people back. Some of them will be problematic indeed. Although, frankly, I think the course that Labour's on is going to produce an entirely new Labour Party, a different kind of Labour Party, which will be quite content in the university towns and in, multicultural inner city London, where they'll still be strong.
So should Michael Heseltine help Boris to buy his own furniture, because he's going to be at number 10 for a while?
He's going to be there. I mean, he's not an old man. He's going to be there for at least 2 terms, I would have thought, given the electoral arithmetic. But Boris Johnson no longer needs Nigel Farage. He no longer needs the ERG.
Yep.
He no longer needs the DUP. In fact, I suppose my Portillo moment was Nigel Dodds being defeated by John Finucane. The DUP were the kingmakers. They were harvesting a lot of gold from the British Treasury, but they're now a surplus to requirements. Boris Johnson is the king of all he commands. And therefore, we may see some surprising aspects of Boris Johnson. Because I hate to tell you this, Boris Johnson's actually quite a liberal fellow.
Oh, yes, there's no doubt about that.
This is no Margaret Thatcher. For all the furore on social media, describing him as a fascist.
Oh, it's insulting and it's totally false.
Utterly rubbish. On social issues, he's a social liberal.
Yes, he is.
Like a lot of the Labour MPs that are now sitting opposite him or will be on Tuesday in Parliament. Leave Brexit aside, what kind of government do you think Boris Johnson is going to run?
I think it's going to be genuinely pro-free trade, which is something that May's economic illiterates didn't understand. So I think that's going to be positive. I think on social issues, Boris Johnson is, and Peter Hitchens has said the same, but in even more withering terms, he is a social liberal, but I don't think he has this desire to shove it down the throats of people the way that the Thornburys and the Stormers do. So in that sense, he's a liberal with a traditional small L, in that he's live and let live, where
he's a party kind of guy, as we know. Like Donald Trump. They like a good party.
They like
do you think
he
might legalize drugs, for example?
I don't think so, and I don't hope so, with the emphasis on that, but I don't think that there's an appetite for that, mainly because with crime rates getting so much worse, and you can't blame Boris for that. I blame, frankly, everyone from Roy Jenkins up to the present day. Maybe it will get worse, maybe it will plateau, but in order to legalize drugs, for those who are non-initiated into knowing that drugs fuel crime, fuel terrorism, fuel social decay and degeneracy, you need to have things fairly placid and then put forward the straw man economic argument, which totally discounts the moral and ethical side. But when people, most of whom are either on drugs, selling drugs, or both, are stabbing and killing each other almost now on a daily basis in London, I don't think it would be a good time.
Basis.
Sometimes it feels like that.
Daily killings, but there's dozens of people stabbed in London.
Yeah, it's tragic.
Every single day. Let's take some calls, Adam. Saeed in Bolton, he's up first. Go ahead, Saeed.
Good evening, Mr. Garrie. I just wanted to say first that I'm a very big fan of yours. I've watched and listened to your show for a very long time.
Thank you very much.
And all mediums. And I wanted to say that it was a terrible lack of coverage when you were unfortunately attacked savagely not too long ago. The media coverage on that was absolutely terrible.
Thank you.
Anyway, I'm a doctor who works in the UK, and I actually went to see the NHS heist after your recommendation.
It's wonderful, yeah?
Weeks ago. Fantastic, fan, and I recommend anyone to see, even if you're not in the medical profession. And I saw Bob Gill and Chris Day actually was there as well.
He's a hero. He was on Sputnik. He was on my television show, which Neil Clark has been filling in for the last couple of weeks, and Adam for a few weeks before that. He was on, so if you look up on YouTube, RT Sputnik, you'll see Dr. Bob give an interview there.
He is absolutely, and he's inspirational to all of us actually. But what perplexed me actually, Mr. Garrie, is at work every day. You know, I came in after the election expecting there to be some gloom, but actually, from all the staff and everyone that I was speaking to on a whole range of economic backgrounds, there was a lot of hope and happiness and satisfaction that, you know, Boris won and the Conservatives won, and actually that...
They won in Bolton also, didn't they?
They did. They took a seat. Yeah. We were 2 seats Labour, 1 seat Conservative, and they won a seat in Bolton, which, you know, has not happened for a long time. And it just, to me, it causes a lot of nihilism a little bit, because it's sort of, well, you know, what can you do? Because I can see what's going to happen. We're going to have an American-esque sort of system.
Well, you say that, Doctor, but he actually picked out the NHS specifically in his post-election, and he showered it with praise and promised to shower it with money and new jobs for people and so on. Are you really sure that he would try to go down that road? I think myself not, because the response, the reaction to it would be the one thing that could actually dump him on his ample backside, because I don't believe the British will ever go along with the Americanization of the health service.
Fair enough. I hope that's true. So he's pledged 33 billion, I think it was today, a large figure today. What I worry, I don't think it's going to be a big transition, but in the documentary on the Bob Gill, he says that people are moving towards a blame culture of, oh, well, you know, we've got an aging population and etc. And therefore we need interventions and subcontracting of services because we aren't good enough to do it ourselves. And that I don't see a big transition happening, you know, and bringing in all the pharmaceutical companies.
Well, yeah, I mean, I can't speak for Dr. Bob, but I would have thought his case would be the health service has already been being privatised since the period of Mrs. Thatcher and accelerating under Blair and Brown, and that process of part privatisation will continue to happen. But an American-style insurance system, I very much doubt that.
Fair enough. Fair enough, Dr.
Listen,
Galloway.
thank you, Said, for a wonderful call. Let's go to line 2. Shazad is in Moscow. I must take a call from Moscow. It might be new instructions. Go ahead, Shazad.
Hello, George. Yes, I am in Moscow right now. I don't live here, but yeah, Putin says hi.
Who did he vote for?
Yeah. I think he wanted, sometimes he wanted Jeremy to win, sometimes he wanted Johnson to win.
Well, either way, he was, according to each other, he was backing both of them.
So I guess he wins no matter who.
He wins no matter.
Yeah.
He wins everything.
A bit like Sturgeon.
Yeah.
Sorry, Shazad. Go ahead.
That's fine. Yeah, I'd like to keep this as short as possible because I know both of you have very little time.
It's also expensive calling from Moscow, so go ahead.
Yeah. So Jeremy Corbyn recently announced after a horrible defeat, of course, that he won't be standing in the next elections, whenever they might be.
He's going to stand down very quickly now, I think.
Exactly. And so my question basically is, who would you foresee as the next Labour leader? I mean, we do see quite a few leftists in the Labour Party, but when I think Jeremy Corbyn in Downing Street, I think I think a free Assange, I think a free Palestine. I see momentum for Bernie Sanders going into his election. I see, I see a couple of radical policies that, few soft leftists in the Labour Party won't necessarily, go ahead.
No, they won't. I think the chances of a left-wing leader of the Labour Party are now zero because none of the very few left-wing Labour MPs that got back have sufficient numbers to be on the ballot paper. They are young, untried, and so on. They're exceedingly unlikely to meet the threshold for being on the ballot paper. So the spectrum will go from Rebecca Long-Bailey and Angela Rayner. They'll be as left as you get. And as right as you get will be Jess Phillips. I can't believe I'm saying these words. Jess Phillips is now a candidate to be leader of the Labour Party. And in between, you'll have the North London Mafia of Sir Keir Starmer, Sir Keir Starmer, Lady Nuggie, otherwise known as Emily Thornberry. They'll be, and Keir Starmer's the bookies' favourite already. He's 2-1. So I rather suspect he'll get it, which means that Tony Blair is back in charge of the Labour Party. So for me, after a long affair, it's over. The Labour Party and me, definitely over, and over forever.
Yeah, but I mean, if you don't mind me asking up a follow-up question, then wouldn't it then have just made sense? I mean, okay, I understand that in hindsight, Jeremy Corbyn should have had a more neutral, or he should have probably been pro-Brexit. But okay, it's all over now. Don't you think that the people in the northeast, shouldn't they have just swallowed their pride and sacrificed Brexit as opportunity cost?
Well, Shazad,
for everything in Labour's manifesto.
Shazad should have, could have, would have, maybe, none of that is important. They didn't. It's not that Labour wasn't warned. I myself, like who was the famous guy in the classics in the wilderness? Cassandra. I cried as Cassandra in the wilderness all of this time. I warned them. I told them what was going to happen. And it did happen. And all these Corbynites that now hate me and unfollowed me and tried to shoot the messenger, they were all wrong. And so they should have listened. And it wasn't only me. It was people very close to the centres of power in the Labour Party. One day I'll be able to name them, who warned them over and over and over again, but they were all ignored. And I'm afraid There's no way back from that now. Shahzad, thanks from the call in Moscow. Let's go to Jamal in Richmond. Jamal.
George, nice talking to you again.
And you,
How
sir?
are you today?
By the grace of God, I'm good. Thank you.
Excellent. And also, Adam, I love both of you guys.
Thank you.
Very kind.
I agree with you greatly on this, right? I have severe qualms with the democracy flagrantly ignoring the public. I mean, ultimately, the public, branch of democracy say we want to leave, and the Labour Party just fights. I mean, it's one of the largest, biggest choice of a generation. These guys
what they did, Jamal, was what Brecht satirized. The party has lost confidence in the people and has decided to select a new one. That's what they tried to do, and it didn't work.
Let me ask you this. Corbyn is a Eurosceptic. Why on earth would he listen to people who hated his guts? I mean,
well, he did that
Blairites
on all kinds of things, didn't he? That's what he did on everything. He preferred the the concession and the appeasement of those who hated him. He was ready to throw his own friends, one of whom is me, under the bus in order to appease them. And that would be ugly enough if it worked. But it didn't work. So it's both ugly and idiotic.
Do you believe that factions of the Labour Party had it out for him? Meaning, kind of similar to things here.
Is the Pope a Catholic? do bears defecate in the woods?
Last question. Ireland. So what happens to the Good Friday Agreement on this?
No problem. Ireland, don't you worry about Ireland. Ireland should never have been our business. Ireland will be reunited before you could say Jack Robinson. Trust me on that. Ireland will be reunited and all of them can enjoy the European Union. But I promise them they won't enjoy it as much as they currently think that they will. Jamal, thanks very much. I need to press on. Here's a question for you, Adam. Do you think the decline in quality of Labour MPs is down to the ending of the grammar schools?
I could have asked that myself because I think that it's a totally true hypothesis. Grammar schools produce people that could walk with kings nor lose the common touch, to quote Kipling. And they were institutions that were very important. They were considered progressive in their day, but they received support from both sides. Beveridge on the Liberal side supported them. Attlee's government supported them. Churchill and Butler in particular, supported them. And then in the 60s, when the Cultural Revolution, I'm talking about the one in Britain, not the more famous one in China. China got rid of theirs wisely. We're still suffering here. But when that happened, in that era of Jenkins under the Wilson government, and I say Jenkins because on social and cultural issues, he was in charge, not Wilson. You had grammar schools become public enemy number one. When the Conservatives got back in, nothing was changed. And there was talk about supporting grammars after 2017, but nothing's going to get done on that front, even in terms of a discussion until Brexit's done. So, yeah, I think it produced people that were very level-headed, very well-rounded, circumspection was something very important. And now with Labour, you have sort of a combination of people who are educated badly educated at good schools and badly educated at bad schools. And it's not exclusive to Labour by any means, but when you think of the logic of it, the grammar schools benefited natural Labour constituents and potentially natural Labour MPs far more than even the other parties. So I think the writer of that question was on something.
Socialist tipster.
He's very much onto something.
And here's another one from Angela in Newport. Adam, do you think we've heard the last of Gina Miller, or has she got more tricks up her sleeve?
Well, this again, I keep mentioning Nicola Sturgeon, who was the other big winner last week, even though I'm no fan of hers. But I can imagine that when Nicola and her SNP start arguing for a new Scottish referendum, Some of the best arguments against having one were produced by the SNP and their gang of lawyers that they surrounded themselves with, like a Hadrian's Wall of barristers. The Hadrian's Wall is going to wear a giant horsehair wig at this rate. So I don't know what Gina Miller's view is on that, and she was saying that she's got another trick up her sleeve, but look, parliamentary sovereignty is now restored, and under a majority government, you're not going to see it challenged with these minutiae and these technicalities. So I think jig is
every
up.
cloud has a silver lining. I believe that Boris Johnson with a majority of 80 is a very dark cloud. But it does have the silver lining that all these people have wasted a very great deal of money. Not usually their own money, money that they got from others. But everyone who has expended, must be tens, scores maybe, of millions of pounds trying to wreck Brexit. Tony Blair, George Soros, Alistair Campbell, the People's Vote people, they've all lost an absolute king's ransom of money.
Well, seeing as Bob Geldof was one of the initial Remainiacs who did a Sex Pistols-style boat run down the Thames screaming at Nigel Farage and Kate Hoey, maybe he can organise a live rock concert festival to raise money for Gina Miller's benefactors and all the others. You could call it Blair Aid, Brexaid, Remain Aid, Merkel Aid, all gather at Wembley Stadium. Do they know it's Brexit time at all?
That's a good moment. What was your Portillo moment? A. Joe Swinson, 52%. Chuka Amona, 28%. Anna Soubry, 20%. Poor Anna.
She can't even win the.
She can't even win
this poll.
the poll for the best Portillo moment. She'll have to go and have a drink and lie down. Oh no, she is already. Now, Ian in Colchester says, Adam, once the UK has left the EU, do you think reduction in UK influence in Europe will result in the EU, Germany, relaxing sanctions on Russia and potential secure energy requirements from Russia? That's an interesting question. It's from Ian in Colchester.
It is indeed.
In other words, will the EU be more or less anti-Russian when Britain leaves?
I think it's going to be exactly the same. Whilst people in this country didn't really notice, the Chancellor of Germany, Merkel, Macron, the French president, the fairly new Ukrainian president of Trump phone call fame, and Putin all met to discuss the Ukrainian issue. Not Trump's Ukrainian issue, but the original Ukrainian issue. And from the very beginning, Britain was sort of chirping at the sidelines when the whole sort of Europe versus Russia over this Ukraine issue began. And so if that was Britain in the EU, I don't think it's going to make much of a difference outside of the EU. And moreover, EU policy towards Russia is essentially American policy towards Russia with a bit of economic self-interest sprinkled on top. So I honestly don't think it's going to make a bit of a difference one way or the other.
Jenny in Newport. On line one, Jenny, welcome to the show.
Hi. You okay?
Yeah, very nice to hear from you.
All right, good. I wanted to talk about why I found it so hard to vote Labour this time, even though I'm a Labour member.
Oh, wow.
And I really, really found it very hard, as a lot of women have, because Labour has been very vocal about women can have penises, which is obviously a bit of a difficulty when actual women disagree quite strongly with that. And so there's problems in schools and everywhere, really, where women haven't got, we're expected to share toilets with men, changing rooms with men.
Sports with men, yeah.
Yeah, sports awards. And, in primary schools, sex education is including gender education, which is conflating sex with gender is a mistake. And
why did Labour go so wholesale down this yellow brick road? It's utterly crazed. It's crazy paving. The Liberals, one expects it from. Why do you think Labour, how does that play in South Wales?
Well, I mean, it's ridiculous because ordinary people, they don't want to know about it. It's you know, to an ordinary person in South Wales, you know, a woman is a woman, a man is a man, and, you know, we don't want our children at schools being taught that they've got an option of their gender, which is, I mean, gender is just simply an expression of sex. It's not an actual sort of thing. And it's very, very confusing, and we're getting a large number of kids who are expressing them that they want to change gender, and so the Tavistock Clinic in London is now taking in 3,500 odd kids a year from under 100 10 years ago, and some of those are obviously from South Wales, and we are having our own gender clinic set up in Wales, which no one's particularly thrilled about, and you know, and obviously, you know, you've got problems like in Birmingham with Anderton Park, where there's a large number of Muslim people, and they don't want they're being very vocal, and I personally think quite brave, because they're always being called bigots and transphobes and all the rest of it.
We're always called bigots if we stand up against this tide of absurdity that has become political correctness. I mean, obviously the children's issue that I'm going to ask Adam about in a second, the children's issue is infinitely more serious. I actually believe this constitutes a crime against children that's happening in this country and in the United States, where children are being given puberty blockers, and it's simply horrendous, and nobody is standing up against it for fear of being denounced as a bigot.
And I spend a lot of time being called a bigot and a transphobe, along with my women's group on Twitter, as we sort of like just discuss things. You know, we get death threats and rape threats daily from...
I'm speechless. I don't know what to say, Jenny. I just want to ask you a much lesser order issue. Labour has gone so hook, line and sinker on this issue that they are now allowing men who identify as women to stand in all women shortlists designed to get more women into Parliament. How crazy is that?
I know, it's ridiculous, and you know, if they will try and actively try and get rid of women who are gender critical, you know, and
my God. Well, look, I'll tell you what, Jenny, stay on the line. I'm going to ask Adam to comment, but they can call me a bigot if they like. They can call me any kind of phobe that they like. But I consider this to be peak madness, and I am going to speak out against it. Adam, what do you say?
Well, I agree. My message to politicians, to pundits, to so-called academics and think tankers: stop sexualizing the children. Leave the children the hell alone. If an adult wants to chop off body parts, add body parts, top himself, do any of those things, that's between him, his friends, his religion if he has one, and other such things. But leave children alone in every sense. Stop politicizing children. Stop sexualizing children. Stop telling children there's something wrong with them just because they're having a bad day, or because they're having growing pains, or because they're bullied at school, as all children are once in a while, or at least once. This fetishization of youth that we've gotten in the political culture and the social culture, now we see that trickling down to very young children. It starts by saying, ignore the generation who fought the Battle of Britain, ignore the people who are paying the taxes to fund the schools that are supposedly educating the children. Then you see people like that loudmouth loudmouth woman who calls herself a communist, swearing like a drunk sailor on television. Why they give her the airtime in this age of so-called no platforming, I don't know. I suppose idiocy doesn't count as a protected social group. And then at the end of that spectrum, of that long journey into darkness, you see children being molested, literally molested, by the schools, by political organizations, by brainwashed parents from these organizations that are trying to destroy a kid's life. Let children be children. They can find out about sexual matters and matters of marriage and relationships when they're in their mid-teens, just like it's always been. Human nature hasn't changed since the Garden of Eden. Legislation shouldn't either.
Well, that was a powerful call and a very powerful contribution from you, Adam. Thank you for it. Let's cross over to the United States. Different subject. Sammy is in Washington State. Sammy, welcome.
Hi, George. How you doing?
Good, good. Nice to hear from you. Sorry it's so late in the night.
Oh, it's all right. I'd like to congratulate you for the creation of your party.
Thank you.
So, wondering about what strategies Bernie Sanders' campaign can implement to avoid the same fate as Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, I wish I knew, because Jeremy Corbyn, I suppose the first thing he has to do is not do what Jeremy Corbyn did, or he'll end up in the same boat. He has to, I could write it now, he has to take the most forthright defensive position and become offensive. He has to say, I am a Jew. I have relatives who perished in the Holocaust. I will not be called an anti-Semite. And he should say it with all the power that he can muster. And he should not retreat from it. He should not apologize for things that he said and done in the past on these matters. Because we have a saying in Glasgow, Sammy, if you don't run, they can't chase you.
Yeah, I totally agree. And going back to what you and Adam were talking about earlier, you're talking about how Jeremy Corbyn capitulated to people who were opposing him and threw people under the bus who were supporting him.
Yeah.
And you can see the same thing with Bernie Sanders, with Tulsi Gabbard and other progressives who've been thrown under the bus, and his going with Russiagate, which is a completely brainwashed narrative.
It's crazy. It's crazy, especially as they've got all the pictures of his honeymoon in Moscow.
Absolutely.
And the Russians will have some too.
Yeah.
Perhaps I better draw a veil over his honeymoon. Sammy, thanks for the call. Sorry about the hour, meaning it will have to be cut short because I've got Laura in London on the line to fit in. At least. Go ahead, Laura.
Thank you very much. Well, I wanted to say that I believe the Tories will now be on steroids with regard selling or privatising the NHS. On Friday the 13th, if you go to Twitter, there's an audio recording from Friday the 13th of Damien Green being interviewed on LBC.
But Damien Green doesn't run the government. Boris Johnson does.
But he's got colleagues and friends in the government.
He does, yeah, of course. There's lots of people, even in the government, that would like to do that. But Johnson himself said what he said, and you heard him. So why do you think that Damien Green's policy will prevail over Boris Johnson's?
Well, because they've had this attitude, this ideology for decades, and Letwin and Redwood wrote the book in the 80s or 70s, Privatising the World.
Yeah, Letwin's not calling many shots in the Tory party now.
But
he's persona non grata.
John Pilger's documentary, The Dirty War on the NHS, is on ITV on Tuesday night, 10:45. And I believe that absolutely everyone needs to watch it or record it if they're in bed or whatever. Because
that's ITV Tuesday, 10:45
in the evening. And if the first 5 minutes doesn't alarm people, then I don't know what will alarm them, because it's about patient dumping, and that sort of thing almost happened to, well, kind of happened to me in London a few years ago. But anyway, what I wanted to say about your first caller, the female who rang in, and she liked the renationalisation idea manifesto that Corbyn had, and she made it clear that that would benefit her finances and her life, etc. And yet she went, and I can understand she being resentful at the Blairites. I am too. What I don't understand or have difficulty understanding is voting for the Tories when it's clear that they have every intention of privatising anything that moves, and they have no intention of renationalising utilities or rail, and prices will just go up and up and up, and the poorest people will be fleeced for the benefit of the richest. So unfortunately, while I understand her anger or resentment, what she's done is voted for...
Laura, her anger and resentment was not at the Blairites. Her anger and resentment was at Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell because of their provocation, her word, the provocation of denying the people who voted for Brexit and won the outcome of that referendum. Can't you see that, Laura?
No, I understand that. I don't believe that that's what Corbyn wanted. I think they had his arm up his back. John
McDonnell and Diane Abbott, they had his hand up his back, yeah?
Yeah, and Starmer and Watson and all of these people. Yeah. If people look at a recording of Thursday night when Jess Phillips didn't realise she was on camera, she was laughing when she knew the Brexit, the polls of that evening. And as soon as she realised she was on camera, she straightened her face and her expression and everything. Okay. I mean, these
Laura,
people
thanks.
have a
I've
lot
got to cut you short.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got to cut you short. It was a very good call. Thanks very much for making it. Mike is in South Carolina. Mike, welcome.
Hi, George. Great to talk to you again.
And you, sir.
I wanted to mention to you, I listened to your show today, and I've heard all the callers from Carol and Chris and a whole bunch of others talking about this is the first time they've ever voted for the Tories. And it just reminds me, you and I are the same age, it reminds me of the time here in the United States when all of the Democrats became Reagan Democrats. And they felt that the party was leaving them, which is exactly what's happened over there right now.
It is quite similar, yeah. These people in these Labour seats that have gone Tory, you could say they are Reagan Democrats. They are Boris Johnson Tories, yeah.
Yeah, almost exactly the same thing, and you and I were right the full time about what his stand about Brexit was going to be, because you can't deny the people's votes to leave. Not when 52% of the people voted for it, and I think it's probably only grown since then. So you automatically put yourself in a minority when you say you're not going to support Brexit.
Yeah, and especially in our system where you only need a majority of one in any constituency, and you've won the seat.
Exactly.
So if it's not like a presidential system where millions of votes are aggregated. It's 10, 11, 12,000 votes in any one particular place, and if you alienate 5,000 people who voted for you last time but vote against you this time, you're out.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
Mike, thanks for the call. Sorry about the hour, making it necessary that it should be brief. I've got a legend on the line. It's Norma in Bristol, who's got advice for Jeremy Corbyn. Norma, welcome.
Hello, George. Well, it is advice for Jeremy Corbyn, yes.
Go on.
I think he should get out of politics. He's 70 years old. I disagree with that Carol, I think her name was, from Halifax, who said that Jeremy Corbyn has not got sympathy for the working class. Now, Tony Benn, he said when he got outside of the House of Commons, he was happier. And you know what? I think Jeremy could follow suit.
Yeah, and if he goes on tour like Mr. Benn did, he'll pack out theatres the length and breadth of the land. Jeremy Corbyn in conversation. He can do as Mr. Benn did and leave Parliament to spend more time in politics.
Well, yeah, and the other thing, he'd be away from all this vilification, and he might give help to, those who need it, because he has got sympathy for the working class. I basically think he's a nice guy, and I just get out of politics.
Well, very powerful call. We'll make sure that your advice reaches him. Thank you very much, Norma. In Bristol, what was your Portillo moment? Joe Swinson, still 52. Chuka Amuna, 20. I thought Chuka would be higher.
Yes.
I mean, Chuka's defeat was one of the sweetest moments for me.
Oh, it certainly was. But I think for me, the sweetest moment of all was that smug idiot Hugh Grant. All of the people he endorsed and campaigned for, every single one of them lost. So I'm sorry for all those nasty things I said, Hugh. Please campaign against everyone I disagree with next time, because you've got the Midas touch.
Well, there's 1 minute to go. You can still vote on that. What was your Portillo moment? Joe Swinson, Chuka Amuna, or Anna Soubry? Chris M. asks, do you think the new House Speaker will try and wreck Brexit like Bercow did?
Well, he can't, because when you've got a majority, it's really impossible for the Speaker, even if it's an overzealous one, to pull the tricks out that Bercow did. Bercow was only able to do what he was able to do because there was no quantifiable majority in Parliament. That's no longer the issue. And whilst we haven't seen much of the new Speaker, Mr. Lindsay Hoyle, what I've seen so far is...
Sir Lindsay.
So that's correct, Sir Lindsay. What we've seen of him so far is much, much more hopeful than Bercow.
He's a top man. He's a top man.
I actually, speaking of Bercow, he was on one of the television stations.
Yes, I was just about to ask you. I mean, he's got no future as a TV political pundit because he takes about 5 minutes to make a single point.
He doesn't have the privileges that one has in the House of Commons.
He's used to this orotund, baroque, and very slow, portentous, pompous delivery. But in television, you've got to act fast.
Yeah, and so I watched it maybe for 60 seconds at a time thinking, I wonder if he's going to slag off anyone interesting for entertainment value, which is the only reason anyone watches television anymore, who's getting slagged off. And instead it was Bercow waxing lyrical about his favourite subject in the world, John Bercow. So,
exactly. Or paying fulsome tribute to the person who had just been defeated.
Well, they were his mates, to be fair.
Exactly, yeah. Why wouldn't Boris give Scotland another referendum, as he would have an even bigger majority in the House of Commons? This from James in Dundee. The thesis being, if Scotland leaves, then the parliamentary arithmetic in the Parliament of England and Wales would be, on current form, overwhelmingly Conservative. But that's too mechanical, rather clunkily also a conclusion to reach, don't you think?
Well, there's a lot of assumptions in there. And the first assumption is that people would vote for independence. I don't think that they would. In the same way that at a Four Nations level, people learned that the baying mobs on social media don't influence elections one way or the other, something I said to much excoriation a few weeks ago. I think with Scotland...
You certainly were vindicated on that.
Oh, indeed. That was the sweetest vindication.
If you spend your whole life on Twitter, then you thought Jeremy Corbyn was in with a 350 majority.
Not only that, you would have thought that he would abolish parliamentary politics and make the people on Twitter member of the Politburo, but it doesn't work like that. Now, the Scottish analogy, moving on from that, is this. The SNP are the most articulate party in Scotland. Their supporters are the most outspoken. I don't know if that means that a majority of Scots would vote for independence. I have a feeling that, if anything, if there was an indie ref held, let's say 3 months from now, I think you'd get an almost identical result to the one you got before Brexit was a word that existed. I think that when push comes to shove, the SNP is a brilliant protest vote, and it's the best of both worlds. You win, but you can still be a rebel. You're a rebel with a cause, but I'm not sure that they want the cause to succeed. Much like the Brexit Party, the SNP could be victims of their own success, but Sturgeon is a bit better of a tactician, I say, unfortunately, than Farage.
Mr. Brown, UK, do you really think that England would need to build a wall with Scotland should the latter get independence and then EU membership? It seems a tad extreme. But hey, England would need to secure the border somehow. They would, wouldn't they?
Well, Julius Caesar built the wall, so I don't know what they're
Just
arguing
rebuild
about.
it, yeah. But I mean, seriously, if Scotland left Britain, joined the European Union, would have to accept free movement of cheap East European labour into Scotland, much of which would much prefer to be in England than Scotland, because there are more jobs in the English labour market than there can ever be in the Scottish labour market by a matter of simple arithmetic. How would you stop those who'd come under freedom of movement to Scotland finding their way into the English labour market?
Well, at a legal level, it's the same arguments that have been deployed to talk about what happens to Ireland in the case of Brexit, because the Republic of Ireland is staying in the EU, freedom of movement, and the rest of it, Northern Ireland isn't. But obviously the qualitative difference is that you can't walk from Ireland to London. You can, if you've got good walking shoes, walk from Scotland, climb what remains of Julius Caesar and Hadrian and the rest of it.
I've done it.
Well done. Yep, so it is possible. So that is the difference. So there would need to be some sort of electronic means of monitoring these things. But I think that the Scottish indie wind is going to quickly drop from the sails. I think it's going to be a brilliant protest issue. I don't see Scotland leaving. I just don't.
Well, I suspect we'll see soon enough because, of course, Nicola Sturgeon has a powerful point when she says we swept the boards in this election. We did so explicitly on demand for a new referendum. It will be very difficult forever for the UK Parliament to deny another referendum. I personally say bring it on.
Yep.
I am looking forward to the short sword fighting back up in my old stamping ground.
To quote Donald Trump, you're going to get tired of winning.
I'm going to get tired of winning and being right. Well, it's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you. And if it was, I hope you'll come back next week at the same time, same place, and bring another viewer or listener with you. Please spread the word about the mother of all talk shows, because I think I can say that this show this evening has been the best post-election coverage over 3 hours that anyone could possibly ask for. We've had every point of view reflected, and that's the way it should be. It's the mother of all talk shows.